All right, so welcome everyone. This is, as I mentioned, the Introduction to Invasive Species webinar that's being put on by the newly formed Southeastern Vermont SISMA. My name is Margot, and I am one of the steering committee members on the Southeastern Vermont SISMA. We'll talk a little bit more about what a SISMA is in a few minutes. Welcome again to the Southeastern Vermont Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So that is what SISMA stands for, the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. This is a newly formed group, and this is actually our first time getting together as a group to present some educational opportunities for people to learn more about invasive species in our region. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking about what is a SISMA and about invasive plants and what constitutes invasive plants. If you're interested in contacting us, there is this Gmail account, SE VT CISMA at gmail.com. We also do have a Facebook account, a newly formed one that we're just getting going. So if you're on Facebook, you can follow us, and we will be posting stuff about invasive species there. So the format for today's presentation, or tonight's presentation, is I'm going to introduce our presenters in just a little bit, and then we're going to talk about what is a SISMA, what resources that the Southeastern Vermont SISMA offers. We'll have a discussion about what are invasive plants, why manage invasive plants, and which invasive plants are common in Southeastern Vermont. And then we're also going to talk about, we have five other topics coming up in this introductory series, including backyard invasives, woodlot invasives, and whether to use chemicals for treatment or what are non-chemical treatment options that one could be using for dealing with invasives. And then also talking about early detection plants. So, and then we will have, after all of the presentation, then we will open it up for most of the time for question and answer. So hold on to those and be thinking of questions that you have about invasive species. And when we get to the question and answer period, we're hoping to have a really lively discussion with our presenters. So our presenters this evening, as I mentioned, my name is Margot Gia. I work with Windham Regional Commission as the Natural Resources Planner. This is down in southeastern Vermont. We will also be talking with Jack Minich, Land Management Coordinator at Vermont Land Trust, and he's a VHCB AmeriCorps member. And Rachel Klisch, biologist with Silvio Conte National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. And Peter Van Loon, who's the lead forester for Vermont Land Trust. So at this point, I'm going to turn our presentation over to Jack, and he's going to talk about what is a SISMA.
Great, thanks so much, Margot, and thank you all for coming. So a SISMA, you'll see it sometimes written as a Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association or area. Sorry for the mix-up there. It should read association, or that's how we've chosen to identify ourselves. And a SISMA is just a partnership of invasive plant experts, public and private land managers, and engaged members of the public. It's not a formal organization by any means, but really just a collection of people who are excited to kind of fill the gaps in invasive species management in a region. Our purpose as the Southeast Vermont SISMA is hopefully to raise awareness of invasive species in our landscape, leverage collective action and volunteer projects, and provide resources and assistance to the community, and that includes you all. And we define community pretty broadly, but we're most excited about working in the Southeast Vermont region. I think we're ready for the next slide. And so what resources will we be offering? A lot of this is still in the planning phase, and a lot of this we would love to see determined by what you all would find most helpful. But please look for more webinars. As we've discussed already, we have a webinar series and you are in it. This is the first webinar of many. And we're hoping once maybe some COVID restrictions lessen, we can do workshops in person. As far as collective action, we would love to get volunteer days going, and maybe work on some early detection and rapid response projects. We'll also be featuring lots of demonstration techniques at demonstration sites that you all can come passively look at. You know, it won't be a formal thing. We'll give you an address and you can come and check it out and see maybe a demonstration technique on knotweed or something similar. And then as far as assistance, in addition to everything that we've already talked about, I'm most excited about getting an equipment lending library going. Obviously, that would require lots of protocols around COVID safety, but we'd love to get some specialty invasive plant management tools in your hands so that you can address invasive species on your land. And I think that's it. And I'll pass it off to Rachel Klisch.
Thank you. So one focus of the CISMA is on non-native invasive plants. There are two key characteristics to these species, and this includes, number one, species that have been introduced often from another country into a new location, such as Vermont, by human activity. And number two, these species are capable of moving aggressively into a habitat and taking over the habitat to the detriment of other species. So these invasive plants do not have the insects or diseases to keep them in check like they do in their native countries. And they certainly take advantage of that when they're introduced into the United States. Next slide. So these invasive plants are introduced through horticultural activities. For example, purple loosestrife is planted in gardens and other landscapes for its pretty purple flower, as well as for its medicinal qualities. Invasive plants are introduced through conservation activities. For example, Japanese knotweed was used for erosion control and was planted on along riverbanks. And invasive plants are also accidentally introduced. And one example of this is Japanese stiltgrass was used as packing material for porcelain in the 1900s, and that's how it was introduced into the US. Next slide. So besides using the CISMA as a resource, there are other resources online that can also be used. Okay, so some resources online include Vermont Invasives. This website is specifically used or available to provide information on various invasive plants in Vermont. You can also report any invasive species, and this is invasive species, not just plants, I'm sorry. You can also report invasive species that you might come across in Vermont, and this goes into a database where someone often will follow up on the report. And then you also will see that there's news and information is available on invasive plants in the New England area. So over here in the left-hand corner, you'll see some links. And if we click on, for example, terrestrial plants, you can narrow your search to the landscape that you're finding your plant in. And then you can choose the plant of interest, for example, Dame's Rocket, and you will find various photos of the plant, identification for the plant, biology, management options, distribution of the plant in Vermont, and how you can help prevent the spread of the plant. Another resource is called Go Botany. Go Botany is managed by the Native Plant Trust, and it's mainly for the identification of plants within New England. So there's various ways that you can identify the plant that you're looking to identify. That's through a simple key, a full key, or dichotomous key. The dichotomous key provides a more in-depth way of identifying your plants. We're going to click on the Simple key. You choose the group that your plant falls within, and then a subgroup. And then you answer some simple questions. And you'll see that it narrows your search. And when you click on the plant, you get a profile of that plant with a lot of photos to help you identify the plant, as well as identifying characteristics for that particular plant. And then one other resource is iNaturalist. This website is where you could get involved in some community science. You will need to create an account in iNaturalist, and it's a very simple process. Once you create an account, you upload a photo of and data and location data of your observations of the natural world. And this observation is put into a data repository where scientists can pull that information and track and evaluate the biological diversity of the entire world. Another great asset to this, this website is the community. They have some great conversations. They can answer a lot of questions, including identifying any species that you're not familiar with. And this is also a great way to track invasive plants. And I believe that's my last slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
I often get asked why we should control invasive plants. And for me, I guess, think of it in in terms of one sort of overarching theme that we sort of take for granted at some point, sometimes, but these days, a lot of us are thinking about much of the time, and that is health. And so I guess the first aspect I'd like to talk about is sort of the big picture of ecosystem health and species diversity. A lot of us know and have seen that as these things get introduced, they quickly take over areas and force out native plants. So the picture on the left is taken in southern Vermont. That's burning bush, honeysuckle, and buckthorn completely taking over the understory of a pine and red maple stand. Then, of course, in the middle, there's knotweed on both sides of a mountain stream. And then on the right, you have garlic mustard that has completely carpeted the understory of a hardwood stand. And what happens here is not only do you have the native plants that are forced out, but everything associated with those native plants, so insects and fungi and those sort of things, are also forced out of the ecosystem, and it starts to make fairly significant changes. Another piece of ecosystem health, obviously, is water quality. It's kind of ironic that, as Rachel mentioned, knotweed was sold as a stream bank stabilizer, because really it is not a stream bank stabilizer. It has a really intense rhizome net, but it doesn't hold the soil very well, as we've seen, and the flood comes along and tears it up, sends it downstream, and any little piece of the plant that's about an inch long and has a node on it, a root, maybe a root piece with a bud or a leaf node, that can start another infestation and make another section of the stream bank susceptible to erosion. The next thing I want to talk about is the economic health. And so from sort of a big picture, again, aspect, Vermont economy is based on our Green Mountains, right? We get a lot of money into our economy based on tourism and recreation. And then there's also all the agricultural and forestry products that come out of Vermont. I'm a forester, so looking at the timber industry, that's $1.5 billion added to the Vermont economy every year. And if invasive plants like we see in the picture on the left take over the understory and keep our forests from regenerating, we are going to lose that forest industry. And if you want to hear more about invasives in forests, Sam Shinesky, the Windham County Forester, and I will be doing a webinar in about a month on that. A little closer to home, if you are a sugar maker and some of the syrup that you sell is part of your income, you get a little bit of bittersweet in your sugar bush, it's a good idea to control it right away, because otherwise you'll get something like you can see in the center picture here, where the bittersweet has gotten up into a mature tree and resulted in the tree breaking. It's also going to foul your sap lines. It's going to strangle your regeneration, and it's going to make it pretty miserable trying to walk around out there. And then the last piece I would say is some invasives, knotweed especially, can be really damaging to personal property. This piece of knotweed that's growing on the inside of somebody's home in Great Britain is pretty shocking. In the UK, you can't get homeowners insurance or a mortgage if you have knotweed on your property. Bankers and insurance companies, I don't think, have figured that out in the US yet. But if you have knotweed near your house, that is an number one priority to get control of. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about wildlife habitat health. We talked a little bit already about knotweed along streams, and there's been some research that shows that fish habitat under knotweed stands is actually degraded because the native insects that would normally be on shrubs, plants overhanging the stream can't live in a knotweed stand, so that food resource for the fish isn't there. Another thing is, in the center picture there, you can see some buckthorn fruit. They look pretty tasty, but if you are a bird or an animal and take that in, it's actually loaded with a chemical called Mgmt, which is a laxative and makes the fruit move through the system really fast and inhibits nutrient uptake. So that is an especially bad one for wildlife, especially if you're a bird trying to migrate south this time of year. You're not going to be able to fuel up on that stuff. There's been research that shows that fruits from a lot of the invasive plants are actually much lower in fats and necessary nutrients. So they're really just kind of junk food for wildlife. And then the last piece, of course, is if you have something like the Japanese knotweed that may have started as the one little plant shown in Rachel's slide and then ends up a few years later looking like what you see on the right-hand side here, where it's completely taken over the understory in a hardwood stand in Pennsylvania. There's no wildlife habitat there. It's completely changed that ecosystem. The next piece is something that I hadn't really thought about until a couple of years ago, and that's people's emotional health. And this came about because I was visiting landowners, and over the course of a few months in the summer, I heard from a number of them that they weren't going to certain parts of their property anymore because it was just too difficult to get there, or it had changed too much, the invasives had taken over. And especially in times like this, in a pandemic, when people really want to get outside and want to get to those places that they love and that recharge them and bring a little sanity back to their life, it's really sad when invasive plants have taken over those areas, and it's important to keep them open. The photos that you're looking at here, if you stick with us and come to some of our programming, you'll be on this property. This is the McCulloch property, so-called, that the Vermont Land Trust owns in West Brattleboro. And the photo on the left was taken in 2002 from the top of a pasture. It's looking south, kind of a nice aspect, nice view. And the photo on the right was taken to the east, or to the west of that, excuse me, looking east, sort of 90 degrees. So what you're looking at is the place where that photo was taken. And it's completely changed. There's so much buckthorn there. It's really hard to walk through, although Jack and I have some plans for how to deal with that. Hopefully we'll be showing you that next year and in years to come, and it'll start to look a little bit more like that photo on the left. And the last thing I want to talk about, and this is a pretty important one, is physical health. So this particular photo was taken next to the most, what I think anyway, is the most used and most popular recreational trail in Brattleboro. It's right next to the West River Trail. And this is an impenetrable infestation of largely honeysuckle and barberry with a fair amount of a little bit of knotweed and a fair amount of multiflora rose as well. It's starting to grow into the trails, which is pretty miserable. If anybody's ever tried to walk their dog or ride a bike or jog along a trail that has multiflora rose and barberry next to it, it's not a terribly fun experience. You know, walking through multiflora rose is kind of like walking through tangled barbed wire. It's really nasty stuff. The other thing that's a big problem with this this kind of a infestation is that it's so dense that it creates excellent habitat for rodents, especially mice. They get lots of protection from predators here. And when you have a lot of them, you also have a lot of ticks. And you have a lot of ticks, you have a lot more Lyme disease. They've actually done research in Connecticut and showed this. You have really dense infestations of barberry and honeysuckle, you end up with something on the order of 10 times as many ticks. The incidence of Lyme disease in those ticks is much higher than in places where you don't have the invasives. The other thing about it is that because there's so much shade, they actually create a microclimate underneath that's more conducive to tick survival. So not only do you have more of them, because it's more humid and they're not being exposed to some of those really hot, dry days where they might get desiccated, they're surviving at a higher rate. So I can't think of a better reason to control invasive species other than to avoid that right there. And I guess with that, I'll turn it back over to Rachel, I believe.
Yeah, I'm going to briefly discuss or introduce some common invasive plants in southeast Vermont. And of course, these can also be found throughout the state. And a lot of these we've already introduced. Purple loosestrife and common reed prefer moist soils. So you'll find these in wetland habitats, and they'll invade wet, moist fields, like agricultural fields, as well as you'll see them along roadsides, as well as riparian areas. Oriental bittersweet, Peter has introduced this species. It is a woody vine, and as Peter mentioned, it will topple trees. And a lot of people like to collect the fruit, which is the pretty red and orange colored fruit, and make wreaths in the fall. And that's one way to spread this invasive. Japanese knotweed we've introduced, and this will definitely take over riparian habitats. Goutweed is a ground cover, and it does have a pretty white flower. This species is often planted in gardens, and it is shade tolerant, and it will take over the understory within forested habitats along riparian areas and fields and wetlands. Go ahead, Marga. Glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, Japanese barberry, and bush honeysuckle are all shrubs. And Peter has introduced these species as well. Japanese barberry is planted in backyards because it has a very pretty orange color in the fall. And this will take over forested habitats. And the buckthorns will actually change the nitrogen of the soil, which impacts the species composition of forests. And garlic mustard was planted or is planted in gardens for its medicinal qualities as well as for its edible vegetation. It does smell like garlic, and you can use it in salads and such. And this is also shade tolerant and will take over forested habitat, as Peter has shown, and prevent regeneration. So these are the most common species that you'll see in the area, and you'll learn more about these in other webinars.
So speaking of other webinars, we just wanted to quickly introduce, before we get to questions and answers, the upcoming webinars that will be hosted by the Southeastern Vermont CISMA. So in 2 weeks, we have backyard invasives, and then invasives in our woodlands, non-chemical invasive species management options, and then the next one, should I spray? Responsible herbicide use and control of invasive plants. And then our final one for the fall series will be early detection species. So all of these, you will be able to register. The only one that currently has an active registration link is Backyard Invasives. The others we are working on trying to see if we can exceed our 100 limit and find another registration link. So as soon as those registration links are available, you can go to this link that's down at the bottom of your screen. And this is through the Windham County Conservation District. They are very generously hosting a page on their website for the Southeastern Vermont CISMA. And all of our webinars are listed there. And as soon as links become available to register for the invasives in our woods and later, then they will be there. The Backyard Invasives is already there at that site and can be registered for. So we hope to be able to see you at some of our upcoming webinars. And for the remainder of tonight, we really want to get into some questions and answers that you have. I know that there were a few people that started asking some questions in the chat. And so I was going to ask our three presenters if they could speak to some of these questions, and then we'll get into questions from that aren't in the chat and that people can start either raising your hand and we can call on you, or you can digitally raise your hand and I can be monitoring there. But Jason Silbeck asked, can you define what geographic boundaries are for southeastern Vermont?
So we left it kind of hazy just because we want to be really inclusive, but Windham County is kind of the shorthand for Southeast Vermont for us, but we're happy and we'll definitely extend programming to neighboring counties, but Windham County is our primary focus. But we're happy to have anyone and everyone from all over the state and New Hampshire and Massachusetts and beyond.
And maybe we should point out, and Rachel, you might be able to speak to this. We are not the first CISMA to be forming in the state. Do you want to speak, Rachel, to maybe some of the other CISMAs that are available?
Yeah, and I might ask Peter to help me with this, but there's a CISMA called the Upper Connecticut River CISMA, and the boundaries for this CISMA includes Vermont and New Hampshire, and essentially goes on the Vermont side, goes down towards Concord, Vermont, and then in the north it goes all the way to the Canada border. And on the New Hampshire side, it's from the Canada border down towards a Whitefield, Jefferson area of New Hampshire. And then there's also the Orleans County CISMA as well in Vermont. And then there's another one. Peter, you're going to have to help me with this one.
Yeah, Jack just put one in the chat, the Upper Wood River CISMA, which is sort of based out of Bethel and that area. And then there's a fairly active one in the Battenkill watershed,
Battenkill.
the CISMA Battenkill watershed. Yep. That's
Right. And as Jack mentioned, especially when we're on Zoom, a lot of these invasives are not just specific to southeastern Vermont. Unfortunately, they are far-ranging all across the Northeast. So the information that's presented in these SISMAs are most likely or in these webinars this fall, are likely to be relevant to no matter where you are in the Northeast. And and again, it's more when we're getting to in-person about whether you'd want to drive down to our region, but we always are welcoming to anyone who wants to join us. So I also wanted to point out that we had a question about whether the links that Rachel shared could be posted, and I did post in the chat the links that she shared for Vermont Invasives, which is an excellent resource for identifying or reporting invasive species that are found, the Go Botany, and the iNaturalist. So those links are there.
Then one other thing I'd say, Margot, is that we will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered, whether you made it or not, and we'll include all of these resources. We'll include the links and probably some other things. If people ask for things that we don't have available tonight, we can include those as well. So look for more information in the next few days from us.
Okay, so we have another question from Victoria, and she asks, who funds your organization?
For now, we don't really have much funding. It's a volunteer organization. We were very fortunate to have Corey Ross, the district manager of the Conservation District, apply for and get a grant that'll help support it. Corey, you want to speak to that?
Yes, we received a small grant from the New England Grassroots Growth Environmental Fund to support some of our efforts to get this up and off the ground. And we're using a lot of that kind of specifically for the webinar programming.
Great, thank you, Corey. And I should mention, and I'm going to miss some partners here. We, again, are a very new group, and we have representatives on the steering committee. I am from the Windham Regional Commission, which is a planning commission for the southeastern part of the state. We're lucky to have Jack and Peter and another Vermont Land Trust member that is, again, from the Vermont Land Trust. We have Rachel from Silvio Conti National Wildlife Refuge, Corey Ross from the Windham Conservation District. We also have some private consulting foresters that are a part of the CISMA group. And I feel like I may be forgetting some.
Representative from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. I'm not sure if you mentioned Sam Chinesky, the Windham County Forester. He's a member as well.
We're very lucky that so many organizations and knowledgeable individuals have joined on to volunteer their time to be a part of this effort. And so we're excited about what this can grow into. And again, we're always looking for input, and we will put that Gmail account in the chat. Maybe Jack, you could do that so people know how to, if they have questions, can contact us. We also have some other questions that have started to come up. So how large does an infestation need to be to report it? And I'm guessing that's on the Vermont Invasive site.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is it can be one plant, especially if it's a plant that's new to the area. But the important thing is for us to sort of get an idea of the extent of the invasion, as it were. And so there are a couple of ways to do it that Rachel already pointed out, the report it button on the VT Invasive site, and also on iNaturalist. Once you have an account, you can sign up for a project. And there's a project, I believe it's called Healthy Forests Vermont. And that's all about tracking invasive plants and trying to get a better handle on where all these different species are, what their distribution in Vermont is. And actually, recently somebody reported, I believe on iNaturalist, that there's Japanese silkgrass in Brattleboro, which I think reported grass in the state. It's exciting that somebody found it and reported it, but a little bit depressing.
All right, so we have another question, and this is a common question and not one that has an easy answer. So whichever the three of you want to tackle this one. So how do we destroy, or where do we put invasives once we have pulled them up? And then in parentheses it says, other than a burn pile.
Well, to a certain extent, that depends on the species. So some species will reroot. So if you're pulling them up by hand, an easy thing to do is just hang them in a tree next door so that the roots are up in the air and they'll dry out. Once that happens, the plant won't be able to reroot. Things like garlic mustard are especially important to control. You can't just leave those out in the woods or even elevated somewhere. You really kind of have to bag those and get rid of them. If you pull them up and leave them, they will, even if you pull them up prior to flowering, if they've started flowering, they have enough reserves in their roots so they'll continue flowering and set seed. So you really have to bag those and take them off site. As far as disposal goes, there aren't great options for that. There may be, in your area, the solid waste district may have a composting program or some sort of program that will take invasive plants. So I would say contact your regional solid waste district. I know some people who do this professionally just have a place in a field or in a gravel parking lot or somewhere where they just pile the stuff and they keep an eye on it. Maybe they put a tarp under it first to make sure it doesn't have contact with the ground. It's a hard one to deal with, but if you're just pulling something like honeysuckle or buckthorn or barberry out in the woods, just hang it in a tree next to where you're working.
And I guess I just wanted to add a caution, like, for example, in the community that I live in, we do have a drop-off site for yard debris and Christmas trees and branches and leaves that we collect. And as we were discussing the other day, I realized I wasn't sure what happened to those materials once people dropped them off there. And so you wouldn't want to just randomly collect all these materials and just drop them off at a center like that without knowing and asking what do they do with it? Because that would be an easy way to spread it if they were just collecting it, chopping it, and spreading it out on fields or something. So really do, if you're taking it somewhere, a solid waste management district or something like that, you really have to ask them the question of what happens to the materials, and would, their compost piles get hot enough to take care of it, or, are they burning it? What are they doing with it? So you're not inadvertently spreading it further. But it's a really tricky question, and we were just having in our meeting the other day discussing that very question, and it's tough. And it's hard for all of us to know exactly what to do. And so we will be talking more about that in some of the upcoming ones where we're talking about management, whether you're doing non-chemical management. There's a whole going to be webinar on that. There's also going to be one on what if you're so frustrated, none of the non-chemical methods are working and you decide to go the chemical route. What should you be thinking about in terms of that? So thank you for that question. And it's one that we all are, working on and trying to figure out. And it's not easy. All right, we have another question here in the chat. Does wall lettuce have reserves to produce seed after being pulled up?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer to that. Do you, Jack or Rachel?
I do not know. I don't have experience with that particular plant.
Can't say I do. It's a new one for me.
So that's one we will take note of, and we'll try to figure it out. Maybe when we send our follow-up email to everybody, we will include some information on that, but I'm not aware whether that's possible or not. James rocket, which is in the same family as garlic mustard, will also do that, but I'm not sure.
I'm Lacey Colmore. I live in Jacksonville, which is part, very southern Wyndham. I have spreading dog bane in my field. And I don't know how to control it. It's just gone crazy. And I would love any advice I could about controlling it or figuring out how to get rid of it.
That's another one that I'm not familiar with. It is a native, don't know if there's been a lot of work on how to control it. I do know that it's a problem if it's in a pasture and you have horses in that pasture. So if you know somebody who has horses and may have dealt with this, that might be a good resource for you, but not sure about that. Do Jack or Rachel, do you?
I also do not have experience with this one either, and I think it's mainly because it's a native species. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I appreciate any help I could get.
I do know that there was a landowner in Newfane, an owner of conserved land in Newfane, that was dealing with this a few years ago. I can check in with her and see what happened. Maybe she answers. We can get back to you.
I would appreciate that. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so there were a few questions in the chat that I had missed. So Ellie asked, what do you know about swallowwort? I'm told it is an invasive, is in Massachusetts. I've been told I have it in my yard.
And that one is an aggressive invasive and definitely should be managed before it spreads any further. And I do not have that much experience with swallowwort, but I believe that there's certainly a way. Chemicals is one way to spray it with herbicide, and then I think pulling. But I haven't done that myself, so I don't know how effective either one of those are.
Ellie, Peter and I can relate our story of black swallowwort at a VLT property called the King Farm in Woodstock. And like Rachel said, chemical management is an option and is one pretty often used. We had one or two individuals of black swallowwort present in our sugar bush, and we very carefully dug it out. It's really easy to, if you're not careful enough, to just pull it and have the above ground portion of the plant break off, and then have the underground portion, which has little root nodes that can resprout into multiple plants. So be very careful if you do decide the pulling route, and do your best to take out as much of the root as you can. But that's been our experience, and we've had limited success. We've had one or two resprouts, but so far so good. But we have to check back on it in a month or so.
I wonder if, oh, sorry, Peter. I was just going to ask if maybe smothering it would be an option. Did you guys try that?
We didn't try that. It's in a forest, so we didn't try that, and it's spread over a fairly wide area. I suppose you could try it. It does have a pretty extensive root system, so it probably wouldn't do to just try to smother the area where you see it. You probably have to go far beyond that. It is a very aggressive invasive. You can get it early. That's the time to get it, because once it's really established, it's hard.
Okay, so here's another one of those very insidious invasives that someone has a question about. Is there a way to get rid of Japanese knotweed besides Roundup or a backhoe?
you and I, Peter, if you can definitely add to whatever I'm going to say. So Japanese knotweed is definitely a hard one to manage, and there are a few experimental techniques that a few SISMAs are using, and one is using a wire mesh that's suspended over the knotweed patch, and the mesh has to be a certain size, and the knotweed comes through and it strangles itself. So that's something new that's being tried in Vermont. Another option, which I haven't had much success with, is smothering the knotweed. And this is, you have to cut the knotweed to the ground, and then you put a plastic tarp, a tarp over it. And it takes years to smother, and the knotweed tends to find its way to daylight. And it will also come through the tarp if it finds any holes or cracks, it will find its way out. And then cutting it, cutting it is a little, you will have to cut it numerous times throughout the season, but that one, I'm a little hesitant with that one, only because the disposal of knotweed, because it will spread just from the nodes or the stem, it will sprout. And so that one, if you're going to do that, I would put it on a tarp and let it dry out, or I would burn it, is what I would do with that. And I would not suggest digging it out, actually, because you can easily spread that, because you're going to spread those roots all around, and that's not a good thing to do. Jack or Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
My folks in Maine are currently trying the cutting method, and it is a once a week they go and cut a 30 by 60 patch that means like usually 300 to 400 little sprouts. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart, and it's not something that you can let go. There's a group out of the Mad River Valley, I believe, that are doing the same thing, and so we're excited to hopefully bring some documentation of that through the SISMA to you all, so you can see what their methodology is and what kind of success they're having.
Oh, another thing, getting back to what Rachel said about the wire mesh technique, we are trying that on the McCulloch property in Brattleboro, and hopefully we'll have some results for folks next spring. I would say that it's fairly expensive, and so it's probably only going to be realistic if you have a fairly small patch of knotweed. The other thing that's new, and we don't have any experience that I know of around here with, is a thing called heat weed, which injects hot water into the roots, around the roots of the knotweed. And it's been pretty successful over in the UK controlling knotweed. And there is a guy in Saxton's River who has one of these setups, not doing work right now because of COVID. But we're hoping that next spring, if things are under control, we'll be able to get him out to the McCulloch property to do a demonstration. So watching our Facebook page and paying attention to what we're doing through the Conservation District page, and hopefully have a demo for watching it.
The only other piece that I can possibly put in for, as a treatment method for knotweed, there has been some success with the use of goats. They are very efficient browsers, better than sheep when it comes to plants like Japanese knotweed. But you also, if you have Japanese knotweed right along a river or a stream, please don't graze your goats right up to the stream bank, because then we have water quality issues. So that's kind of the challenge with using live animals plus containment. But great questions, and we also will be addressing some of these specifics around Japanese knotweed and showing some pictures and resources for non-invasive use in the non-invasive, non-chemical webinar. So I'm wondering if there's any other questions that we have in the last few minutes that we have in this webinar. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I invite you to, the link is in the chat. If you scroll back up for the Conservation District, it was posted by Corey Ross. And at that link, you will find, as we have the links available to register for those upcoming webinars, I'll just share that screen just really quickly again. So that you can see what we have for upcoming webinars. So again, we're going to be focusing next on September 30th on backyard invasives. Then we're going to be talking about invasives that are mostly found in our woodlots. Then at the end of October, we have the non-chemical invasive species management options. In November, should I spray? Responsible herbicide use in the control of invasive plants. And then we have early detection species. That's coming up in the first week of December. So we really appreciate everybody joining us this evening, and we hope that you got inspired to learn about this really confusing and really wide-ranging topic of invasive species, know about some resources where you can learn more about invasive species, and also stay in touch with us, this newly formed SISMA, to help. And we're always looking for feedback, because we're interested in knowing what is going to be the most useful for you as residents of Vermont or beyond, as to what's going to be helpful. What kind of field trips would you be interested in? What kinds of webinars would you be interested in? What kind of, if we could bring in experts to speak about a specific species, what might that be? So we really appreciate, again, for joining us this evening. And we will be sending a follow-up email probably next week that has the link to this webinar, as well as the links to some that we shared this evening, and maybe some answers to some of the questions that were asked that we weren't able to answer this evening.
Speaking of which, Margot, there are a couple other questions, if I can just interrupt for a second.
Yes, definitely.
The late ones came in. So one is goutweed the same as bishop's weed? Or yes, that is the same thing. Another one was, has anyone had success with industrial vinegar in managing knotweed? And I have not heard of any success with that, and would not expect.
I might comment on that. I use boiling water, white vinegar, and salt. And that will take care of, it does the job.
How do you apply that, Lacey?
Patiently. I put it in a big spray gun, and I apply it that way.
And you apply it more to the base of the plant, or is it more foliar?
Right. Base of the plant.
Interesting.
It does work. It does work. You have to use a lot of salt. But so anyway, for what it's worth. But the goutweed, I'd be interested in how you manage that, because, wow, that's just incredible. I've tarped it. I tarp it. That's how I manage it.
It's really hard.
Yeah. And I think I have a friend who used a backhoe, and it didn't even work.
I have a friend of mine who's an ecologist said the only way to get rid of goutweed in your yard is to move. Get a new yard.
That's not very encouraging, Peter.
Yeah, I know. It's awful stuff.
Well, thank you all. So this will officially conclude the evening's presentation, but if you want to hang on and ask a question, our presenters may be able to spend a few extra minutes and can answer a few questions. But we just, again, wanted to say thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at some of our future programs.
I'm really interested to hear what people would like from us, from the SISMA, as Jack mentioned in his presentation. We're really keen to find out what you need, try to provide it for you.
I have a quick question for, I'm not sure who, maybe Peter. We live in West Brattleboro, and I haven't heard of the McCulloch property. Is that something worth taking a walk on, or where is it?
It's on Meadowbrook Road. There's one trail that sort of cuts through the middle of it. If you're headed up the hill from Route 9. As soon as you go across the bridge, more or less, it's on the right-hand side of the road. There's a dead-end driveway that goes out and ends sort of between a field and the old pasture that was in the picture. If you want to see invasive plants, that's a great place to go because, man, have we got invasive plants there. We'll be doing a lot of workshops and in person, hopefully demonstrations and maybe some volunteer days. So want to go have a walk around? Help yourself.
Thank you.
So there was a comment from Gisette that a field trip would be nice, but we're all dispersed throughout the state. And that's where we do recognize that, you know, when we are no longer in our webinar phase and we're able to do in person, that it may limit us down back to the southeast. Although you are always welcome if you want to come drive down to this beautiful part of the state. We always, you know, love to host visitors down here. It's a great place to visit. And we will also be continuing these webinars so that people from all over the state and even beyond, I think we had someone from Maine this evening, can join us and learn. So we're going to do a combination of both.
Thank you all for coming and for engaging with us and asking good questions.
Thank you, everyone. And please connect through the Facebook, which maybe Margot could pop up, and or the email address, and just let us know, like Peter said, what resources you'd like to see. And if you have questions like, how do I get to the McCulloch property in West Brattleboro? That's a great place to ask, and we can give you more specific directions or a Google Maps link or some more resources for what you might find there.